All right, so so this is one of my favorite chapters. This is exercise in hot and cold environments and extreme environments. And for me, this is one of the most interesting part of exercise physiology. How do we as humans survive, number one, in these extreme climates, and two, how are we going to perform exercise in these climates? So the first question is asking, what are the different avenues of heat transfer? So remember, there are 4 different ways we can transfer heat. The first one being conduction, the second one being convection, the third, not in any order, but this is the way I remember it, is radiation, and then the last is evaporation. Evaporation is the only avenue that we're able to, or is the only avenue that's going to is the main avenue which we dissipate heat during exercise. So 80% of our heat loss during exercise is through evaporation. So if our evaporatory capacity is reduced, the amount of heat gained by the body is going to increase dramatically. So think about athletes who have a lot of gear. So football players, they're at an increased risk of heat illness because they have a limited evaporation capacity. Occupational health, those firefighters, city firefighters who have, where they have their suits that provide incompensable heat stress, meaning they're not able to compensate for that heat stress because they can't evaporate because of their equipment that they're wearing. Hazmat suits is another example of where your evaporative capacity would be reduced. So in those types of environments where our evaporation capacity is reduced, it's going to hinder our ability to dissipate heat. And that's when we need to really regulate the breaks that individuals take, make sure they're hydrating, and just make sure that their core body temperature isn't increasing to dangerous levels. Okay, so the other 3, right, work in both directions, meaning we can gain heat and dissipate heat through these mechanisms. So conduction is through direct contact with an object or surface or material. So that would be holding a hot cup or hot mug on a cold day, wrapping your hands around it. You are receiving warmth through conduction from the mug. Convection is the movement of gas or liquid. Around the body. So this could be turning on the fan on a hot day, and that movement of air would help to dissipate heat. And this is the reason why sometimes you might notice this. Going outside for a run, you might feel like you're sweating less versus exercising in an indoor environment without any sort of air movement. It's because outside when you're running, you have more convective heat loss occurring versus being stationary in a room without any air movement. And then radiation is the heat that's going to be given off or accepted as infrared rays or the sun or a heat lamp if you have those. And this is how this is the main avenue of heat loss at rest. So, so radiation can either be on you're accepting heat. So on a hot sunny day, there's no clouds in the sky. Maybe you're running over asphalt, you're getting heat, you're gaining radiative heat from the sun, and the sun is bouncing off the asphalt and being reflected back onto you. So it's adding the amount of heat that your body has versus running on a cloudy day where there's not going to be less heat that your body will absorb through the sun. Okay, so what is the difference? Oh wait, Christy has a question. Are we reviewing altitude in chapter 20 next week? So next week we are reviewing altitude and body comp and nutrition and the exercise prescription. So we're going to be covering all the sections. So we're not going to have one day of reviewing everything. I'm just going to, on the 3, including today, the 3 consecutive days, we'll cover everything as far as the review questions go. Okay, so what is the difference between heat acclimation and heat acclimatization? Heat acclimation, you just think of this, acclimatization has a Z in it. So if you turn it on its side, it's an N, and this is going to stand for natural. So heat acclimatization is the process of gaining adaptations to heat in a natural environment. Versus acclimation is the process of gaining adaptations to the environment in a artificial environment. So if we're talking about heat acclimation, we're talking about somebody exercising in a hot chamber to get these adaptations to the heat. If we're talking about altitude acclimation, we're talking about someone using an artificial chamber to simulate altitude to gain the adaptations to altitude. If we're talking about heat acclimatization, this might mean actually being in a hot environment and exercising in the heat to gain the adaptations. And the same thing with altitude. So altitude acclimatization is a natural process, meaning the person is actually at altitude and gaining adaptations to altitude. So what are some of the ways we acclimate or acclimatize to heat? And which are the earliest adaptations? So the first thing that happens is our plasma volume expands. And this is a significant adaptation, because what does it mean if our plasma volume expands? It means now if we use this equation, Q is equal to heart rate times stroke volume, this means now that heart rate can decrease, right? Because our plasma volume has expanded. And as a result, according to Frank Starling's mechanism, stroke volume will increase, which means that our Q, our capacity to exercise, our cardiac output during exercise will increase or be maintained over a prolonged period of time during exercise. Right, so it has a protective effect, meaning it's going to help us to perceive a lower exercise workload, although we're working at the same absolute workload. And how do we detect a plasma volume expansion? In one of those slides in the heat section, I had a slide that talked about the different graphs on it. So heart rate decreases over time, hematocrit decreases over time, hemoglobin decreases over 7 to 10 days of heat acclimation. And so we measure plasma volume expansion by the changes in hematocrit and hemoglobin, right? So concentrations in hematocrit and hemoglobin are going to oppose our plasma volume. So as plasma volume expands, hematocrit decreases. As we become dehydrated and our plasma volume decreases, our hematocrit increases. So these are relative changes that are happening that are being dictated by the changes in plasma volume. So this is how we measure changes in plasma volume or plasma volume expansion during heat acclimation, is that we can tell because of the relative decrease in hematocrit and hemoglobin. Okay, so if we have more plasma volume and more cardiac output, this also means our blood flow to the skin will be increased or maintained. And this is going to help us to thermoregulate or dissipate heat. So in effect, heat acclimation or heat acclimatization means that our core body temperature will be lower at a given workload. And this is because of the plasma volume expansion. At the same time, our mean skin temperature will also be decreased. And as a result, our performance time or our amount of work is going to be increased. We can now sustain exercise for a longer period of time before the amount of heat that builds up reaches a critical level. Okay, so that's plasma volume expansion. The next thing, also plasma volume expansion is the first adaptation to occur. So this is one of the first things to occur, and it's one of the most important adaptations that we develop in response to heat acclimation. And likewise, as we lose our adaptations to the heat, our plasma volume, we lose this adaptation. So it's the first to arrive, and it's one of the first to leave after, if say we don't keep up with our exercising in the heat. Okay, so the next category is sweating. We have an earlier onset of sweating, which means that, remember, the main avenue that we use to dissipate heat is evaporation. What does that mean? It means that we sweat and the sweat will evaporate off our skin. And this is what we mean by evaporative cooling. So if we have an earlier onset of sweating, this means that now our ability or our thermoregulatory system has kicked in sooner. So this is going to help to delay a higher core body temperature or higher body temperature. And as I mentioned in the lecture slides, what we see is that as we start to sweat, so if we start to exercise and we're not yet sweating and we were to measure our mean skin temperature, it might be, say, 35 degrees Celsius. As soon as we start sweating, your mean skin temperature drops immediately to maybe 33 degrees Celsius. So this sweating, this evaporative cooling is essential in keeping our core body temperature below the critical temperature and tries to maintain homeostasis. We also have, so the earlier onset of sweating means that it helps to cool the body faster or at an earlier time point. We also have an increased sweat rate, which is going to be helpful because this is going to enhance our evaporative cooling, especially in a hot and dry environment. Right? I say this because if we were exercising in a humid environment, increasing our sweat rate would not be helpful because we'd just be wasting our sweat. The sweat would just roll off our skin and not provide evaporative cooling. And we know this living in Hawaii, where we've had those days where we're exercising, we're sweating, the sweat is just rolling off our skin, and we still feel extremely hot. And in those cases, the best case for us to do is to turn on the fan or have some sort of airflow to try and increase the amount of evaporative cooling. So another important adaptation is that our sweat becomes dilute. We become better sweaters. And by this, I mean, we're able to reabsorb sodium chloride in the ducts, the sweat ducts, prior to it leaving our body. So this means that we get to keep more sodium, which is extremely beneficial because with a higher sweat rate, we have less time, our sweat glands have less time to reabsorb the electrolytes. So the dilute sweat is an extremely important adaptation. Otherwise, we would lose copious amounts of, and this would be extremely detrimental to us because sodium, remember, for our sodium potassium pumps, and poor sweaters, meaning individuals who sweat copious amounts of sodium out with their sweat have an increased risk of muscle cramps and heat cramps. So this dilute sweat is important because remember, the sodium is needed for the sodium potassium pump. And poor sweaters, meaning they sweat copious amounts, have an increased risk of heat cramps or muscle cramps. But remember, even though we're able to reabsorb sodium chloride, we're unable to change the dilution of potassium, magnesium, and calcium, meaning that these concentrations of these electrolytes are similar between sweat and plasma. And another tidbit is that females have better skin wetness feedback, meaning females typically, if they're sweating a lot and the sweat is just rolling off their skin, their sweat rate would actually decrease versus males who would not have a change in sweat rate. So in this sense, females have a better, I guess, ability to sense when their sweat is being used for evaporative sweat loss, or if it's just being lost as sweat that's rolling off their skin. So the overall takeaway from adaptations to the heat is that now we're able to exercise or work for a longer period of time with a lower heart rate, a lower perceived exertion, with a lower core temp and mean skin temp. And this is why individuals might want to heat acclimate prior to performance in the heat, because it's going to improve your performance and also reduce your risk of heat illness. It's going to be a protective mechanism against heat illness. Okay, so what is WBGT? So this is wet bulb globe temp. And it's important because, as I mentioned in the lecture videos, a lot of times coaches or those who put on athletic events only take into account the heat index. So the heat index takes into account temperature, ambient temperature, and wind speed. Was it wind speed? No, that's cold. Heat index does not take into account globe temp. Oh my gosh, I'm drawing a blank. Heat illness index takes into account relative humidity and ambient temperature. Is that correct? Am I saying that correctly? So wet bulb globe temperature takes into account humidity, ambient temperature, and any sort of radiation that might be coming from the sun. So radiative heat. And this is important because we know that living in Hawaii, the sun is going to add a lot of heat depending on cloud coverage, depending on the weather, what time of day it is. So this is why individuals that are putting on athletic events or coaches need to use the wet bulb globe temperature versus just the heat index. So what is the most important which is the most important factor? It's going to be wet bulb, right? So whatever your wet bulb globe temperature is, that's going to account for 70% of your total temperature. And then the next is your globe temperature. Your globe temperature, again, is going to take into account the radiation from the sun. So remember, so your globe temperature is the temperature in a metal sphere that is painted with a flat black paint, meaning it's going to detect or measure radiation, the radiative heat, the energy from the sun. So if you're working indoors, your globe temperature and your dry bulb temperature will be the same. But if you're outdoors, right, it will possibly be different. Also, the key here is that wet bulb accounts for 70% of this total temperature. Why? Because remember, evaporation is our main avenue for heat dissipation. And so how humid the environment is going to dictate how good of a job that we're going to be able to dissipate heat and thermoregulate. And that's why it's weighted heavier than dry bulb and globe temperature. So globe temperature, I mentioned, it's measured with a thermometer in a metal sphere painted with flat black paint. Your dry bulb temperature is just a thermometer that's measuring ambient air or ambient temperature. And your wet bulb is going to be measured with something called a sling psychrometer, where you would put a piece of wet gauze on the end of a thermometer and you would swing it around. And what's going to happen is that temperature in that thermometer is going to drop, right? Because the gauze is wet. And eventually it's going to reach a point where it's going to reach a steady state. And that's going to be your wet bulb temperature. So the drier the air, the larger the drop as you swing this sling psychrometer. The more humid the air, the smaller the drop in temperature you're going to find. And this is how we use or how we measure wet bulb globe temperature. Okay, so the next question is, what are the different heat illnesses and the treatments for them? So let's start with the least severe. So the least severe would be heat cramps, and then the next would be heat exhaustion, and then heat stroke. So heat cramps manifest as muscle cramps, usually in the lower legs, in the calves. And as I mentioned earlier, a main culprit for this would be poor sweaters, meaning they sweat copious amounts of sodium, but don't replenish completely. And so eventually they have a reduced concentration of sodium, and it's going to alter that sodium potassium balance. And the treatment for this would be to increase sodium intake. So if in those individuals participating in those long distance runs, it's beneficial for them to have salt tablets with them so that they can be sure that they are replacing their salt at a rate that they're losing it through their sweat. Heat exhaustion is the next heat illness. And this is when an individual is no longer able to dissipate heat at the rate that they're gaining it. So they're gaining heat faster than they can dissipate. And this increases their core body temperature beyond 39 degrees Celsius, which is typically what we say is the limit, where we typically say this is the critical temperature. Anything above this, you're likely to suffer from heat stroke. But that's not always the case. There have been marathoners whose core temperatures were higher than 39 degrees Celsius, and they didn't exhibit any signs of heat illness. So these temperatures I'm throwing out are the textbook numbers, but it's not always what you would see in the field. So heat exhaustion, inability to dissipate heat at the rate heat is being generated or gained, right? And so that body temp increases beyond 39 degrees Celsius. And what you will see here is confusion. The person may faint, and their skin may still be wet, but they might not be sweating copiously. And the treatment would be to move them into the shade. If they're conscious, cool water rehydration drink, and just to monitor. Heat stroke is a life-threatening stage where now their body is not dissipating heat at all. It's not trying to dissipate heat. And this is why the treatment for this is an ice cold water bath, meaning since the individual's physiology is no longer trying to dissipate heat, now we have to apply external environments so that we're going to help them to dissipate the heat. So putting them in an ice cold water bath while circulating the water is going to maximize our conductive and convective heat loss. Because remember, now they're no longer sweating. So evaporative cooling has been taken out of the equation. So now we need to rely on convection and conduction to dissipate that heat. So putting them in an ice water bath and stirring that water around them is going to help them to dissipate the heat the fastest. And this is the best way to bring down core body temperature the quickest. If you don't have an ice water bath available, ice packs on their major arteries, so their armpits and groin area, fanning, moving them into the shade would be the best that you could do. But it's not as effective as dunking them in an ice water bath. And athletic trainers on the field typically have a tarp, right, that they can use to make a makeshift kiddie pool if they need to treat an athlete for heat stroke. So the symptoms of heat stroke is confusion, massive confusion. So the best way to figure out if someone's suffering from heat stroke is to ask them a simple question. If they're unable to answer or have a coherent conversation, you know that it's time to get that water bath ready, because they're probably suffering from heat stroke. So with heat stroke, there is different theories of why this becomes life-threatening. One is called the hot brain theory, where this theory just says when your brain temperature reaches a critical temperature, your body shuts down. There's other theories, one being with high core body temperatures, your gut or your GI tract becomes leaky, and this allows the interior to leak out, and this can lead to sepsis and inflammation. But let me think, anything else? So heat stroke, life-threatening, treatment is ice cold water bath. And they're unable to answer simple questions, right? Hold a conversation. And the idea if you're a coach is to prevent your athlete from getting to heat stroke. So making sure to incorporate heat acclimation or heat acclimatization procedures, making sure your athlete is rehydrating. But this becomes a problem when they're wearing equipment or they're participating in a long endurance event where taking breaks is not going to be conducive for their overall performance. Okay, so what is the difference between hypohydration and dehydration? So hypohydration is a decrease in plasma volume, but osmolarity stays the same. So dehydration is what happens over a long distance event. So maybe you're running a race over the desert. You're going to have a decrease in plasma volume. And as we lose plasma volume, the amount of stuff in the blood, the hematocrit, the osmolality, is going to have a relative increase, right? So we have a relative increase in osmolality. And this is because we're sweating. And losing water this way. Hypohydration, when do we become hypohydrated? Bed rest will do this to us, meaning we become sick and now we're in bed rest and now we're supine. Our venous return increases because now we're in a supine position. Venous return increases, so our atria, our heart is going to detect, the baroreceptors in our heart detect an increase in venous return, and as a result, it releases ANP, atrial natriuretic peptide. This should be review, and this encourages diuresis. So we lose plasma volume this way, but our osmolality remains the same. This also happens with astronauts in microgravity, where in microgravity, right, venous return increases because now there's no pull of the gravity. The atria detects, the baroreceptors detect an increase of blood pressure and venous return. As a result, ANP is released and we diurese. So this is a difference between hypohydration and dehydration, with the main difference being one, hypohydration has no change in osmolality, and dehydration, we have a relative increase in osmolality. And the example I provided in the lecture was if we had a big pot of salted water. So if you have water and you add a lot of salt to it, hypohydration would be taking a ladle and ladling out this salty water. We're losing total volume, but our osmolality is remaining the same. Versus dehydration is if you were to turn on the stove and boil the water would evaporate. So our plasma volume is decreasing, but the amount of salt and solutes remain the same. So this is accounting for the increased relative increase in osmolality. Okay, so what effect does hydration have on performance? How much dehydration would hinder performance? As I mentioned earlier, plasma volume is what we need to maintain our exercise, our endurance exercise and performance. So a 2% drop in body weight, which is how we measure weight is one way to measure hydration, right? Would hinder endurance performance. So hydration is extremely important because maximizing our plasma volume means now our stroke volume will be increased and our heart rate will be decreased, right? So if I go back up here, so if we are able to have a plasma volume expansion, our heart rate is going to be able to be decreased, and this is going to function to increase stroke volume. And this is in reference to Frank Starling's mechanism. And if you recall in a previous lecture, I said that infusion of saline in a dehydrated individual would help them to maintain their endurance performance. And the whole basis behind that is their plasma volume is going to help them to increase their cardiac output. It's going to help them to dissipate heat with exercise. And it's going to help them to keep their muscles perfused, right? This is the transportation of substrates, O2, removal of CO2. This is the importance of plasma volume with exercise. So just a 2% drop. So if you take your body weight and multiply it by 2%, if you were to become dehydrated by that amount, it will greatly hinder endurance performance. So in other words, your heart rate would be higher at a given absolute workload. Your onset of blood lactate accumulation will decrease, which means you will tip over into acidosis sooner. Why would this happen? Because with a decrease in plasma volume, now you have less transportation of substrates, mainly fat mobilization, right, for endurance events. You have less delivery of O2 and removal of CO2. So now you need to shift your reliance onto more glycolytic metabolism. And when we do this, it's going to increase the amount of lactate and acidosis that's occurring. And this is why it's going to decrease your onset, or it's going to decrease your ventilatory threshold. It's going to decrease your ability to sustain high intensity exercise over a prolonged period of time. So overall, you'll have a decreased time to exhaustion, so you won't be able to perform as much work at high intensity that maybe you are used to. However, what might not be affected is muscular strength and endurance. So in an anaerobic capacity may stay the same, or it may decrease depending on the athlete. So mainly this plasma volume drop in dehydration is going to affect your endurance or aerobic capacity and not so much your anaerobic capacity. All right, so let's go on to cold. So we talked about all these different adaptations to the heat, which are really cool, right? We sweat more dilute sweat. We sweat sooner. We sweat more. Our total sweat rate increases. Our plasma volume expands. So we do fairly well in the heat. In the cold, we don't do very well at all. We don't show any physical adaptations to the cold. We don't have any solid adaptations. We can't say our plasma volume expands. We can't say we generate more heat. We don't have these adaptations. What we do is we adapt. We kind of just do our best to deal with the cold. And there's 3 ways which we adapt or deal with the cold. And the first is we habituate. The second is we insulate. And the third is we have a metabolic response. So the habituation just means we get used to the cold. It just means we have a blunted response. And you guys know this. If you've ever lived in the cold or been in the cold, you know that day one, you have blankets and jackets. And then in the middle of winter, you might be fine in just a t-shirt. We just habituate, we become used to it. We're not as bothered by it. By insulate, this is what I mean by this is we vasoconstrict more, meaning we become better at vasoconstricting our arterioles in our skin. And this way our blood and our core body temperature and our heat stays within our core, and we're not losing heat to our periphery and then to the environment. And that's important because that's how we dissipate heat, right? How we dissipate heat is move our heat from the core to our periphery, to our skin, and we dissipate heat that way. So when we're cold, we do the opposite, where we try and shunt our arterioles and try and keep our blood in our core. And we try and we do our best to not lose as much heat to the environment as much as possible. And one thing to remember here is our subcutaneous fat doesn't necessarily insulate us against the cold because our arterioles are above our subcutaneous tissue, right? So our arterioles here and our subcu fat is here. So it means that, yes, our subcu fat might help to maintain our core temperature in the cold, but it doesn't help us insulate and protect us and protect our surface arterioles. And this is important because as we age, our vascular health declines, where our ability to vasoconstrict and vasodilate decreases. So this is why perhaps maybe you've noticed in grandparents or parents, they seem to be colder in an environment where we feel thermal neutral. And at the same time, they may gain heat faster in an environment that we feel comfortable in. And it's because their ability to vasoconstrict in cold and vasodilate when it's hot is going to affect, or it's going to decrease their ability to thermoregulate. So as we age, our ability to thermoregulate our core temperature decreases. And then our metabolic response means we rely on shivering if necessary. This is not a beneficial response because shivering uses glycogen as its main substrate. And basically, we're just wasting our body's preferred source of energy. We may have an increase in T3 and T4, so triiodine-threonine and thyroxine, which may help to increase the amount of heat production within our body. And with our vasoconstriction response, we're able to keep our core temperature warmer. So age affects our ability to adapt to the cold because, and this is related to our ability to vasoconstrict. And then if we're talking about in the heat, our inability or decreased ability to thermoregulate in the heat is because of our decreased ability to vasodilate. So how does cold affect our performance? So first thing that always comes to my mind is the hobbling effect, because I don't do well in cold. I need lots and lots of clothing. And with this clothing, there's a hobbling effect, meaning you're not very thermodynamic anymore, right? You're not thermal. You're not aerodynamic. You're not able to move with efficiency because of the bulky clothing. And then, since we're vasoconstricted, right, our blood flow to our working muscles are decreased, which means what? Less substrate delivery, less O2 delivery, less CO2 and metabolite removal. So what does this mean? This means we need a shift to glycolysis for energy. Along the same lines, we become cold. What happens when our core body temperature drops? We have a leftward shift of our oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. And what does this mean? This means hemoglobin gives up less oxygen to myoglobin. Essentially, there's less O2 delivery to our mitochondria. So this is another reason why we have a shift to glycolysis. Right, so this is another reason why we depend on glycolysis for energy, even though in the cold, we might just be sitting. We might not be exercising at a high intensity, but yet we're shifted our reliance onto carbohydrates and glycolysis. At the same time, our maximal heart rate decreases, and this is related to reduced stimulation of our sympathetic nervous system. So with so this is our heart rate max decreases. However, our heart rate at any given exercise intensity will be increased, right? Why? Because we had a drop in plasma volume. Does that make sense? So although our maximal heart rate decreases, our heart rate at any other given intensity lower than our maximum volitional fatigue will be higher because we have less plasma volume to work with. Why do we have less plasma volume to work with? I don't think I covered this. Because we're vasoconstricted, right? So we have a total blood volume of say 5 liters. As we vasoconstrict now, more of this blood is staying within our core and more blood is going to be returned to the heart. So with vasoconstriction, we have an increased venous return. This is detected by the baroreceptors. The heart ANP is released. And this really results in diuresis. So our plasma volume decreases. So at any given intensity, our heart rate's going to increase. But our maximum heart rate, our capacity to exercise at max, is decreased. Okay. Let's see. And then if we're talking about the extreme cold, now we're talking about survival. We're not talking about exercise. And if we were exposed to the extreme cold and now we're in survival mode, this is going to suppress our metabolism, right? So if we're unable to deal with the cold because we don't have any real adaptations to cold, we might slip into hypothermia. And this is when our core body temperature decreases to less than 35 degrees Celsius or 95 degrees Fahrenheit. So we're really working with a small window of temperature, right? So 2 degrees Celsius, maybe 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. This is the scope at which our body temperature needs to be maintained to survive. And then if we do not rewarm, clinical hypothermia is when our core body temp drops by 1 degree more Celsius and then 2 degrees in Fahrenheit. And clinical hyperthermia is going to drastically slow the rate of our SA node firing. And this can result in ventricular fibrillation and cardiac arrest. And this happens. This is a result of an alteration in our sodium potassium balance, and it's also an alteration in our viscosity of our sarcoplasm, in our cardiac tissue, in our muscle cells. Our sarcoplasm viscosity increases, hindering the ability of these muscles to contract. So cardiac arrest is typically the fate of clinical hypothermia, and cardiac arrest is the main cause of death from hypothermia, and it's related to the slowing of the SA node firing and the inability to maintain heart function. However, if someone is being treated for hypothermia, so say you're treating someone for hypothermia and you're starting to warm them, what happens when you warm them? They start to vasodilate, right? So this can result in something called the afterdrop, where although you start warming the individual, their core body temperature drops further. And this is due to the vasodilation of the vessels. So as you warm, right, vasodilation is going to occur, which is going to dissipate heat. So that's what we call the afterdrop. The afterdrop is you start to warm an individual, and instead of their core body temperature increasing, it actually decreases. And the last question is, what is poikilothermic? It is the point at which the body stops trying to warm itself and the body cools to ambient temperature. So this would be similar to heat stroke in the opposite terms, where heat stroke is the point at which evaporative cooling stops and the body can no longer dissipate heat at the rate it's gaining it. And then poikilothermic is on the opposite end, where the body has stopped trying to insulate, habituate, and use metabolism to warm the body, and the body is just going to start to cool to the ambient temperature. All right, so that's hot and cold in a nutshell. We're at 10 o'clock. I was thinking of going through altitude because I was worried about having enough time to go over everything. So I'm going to start this worksheet or review question. Let's see how far we can get. I just want to make sure we have enough time to cover everything. Being the last stretch in the semester, we need to stay focused. So I'm going to go over this as much as possible until we run out of time. If you guys have questions, put in the chat box, but I'll stop 5 minutes prior to class ending to answer any questions that you may have. Okay, so this is altitude. Altitude is so interesting. So the first thing that happens that you might notice if you've ever been to altitude is our ventilation increases. And that might be the first thing that you notice. So even before we get into these different effects of altitude on the physiology, there's going to be a drop in barometric pressure. Right, so here at sea level, it's 760 millimeters of mercury. Depending on where you go in altitude, so moderate altitude might be 560 millimeters of mercury. High altitude might have a barometric pressure of 260 millimeters of mercury. And the issue with this, remember, we need to multiply this by the percentage of oxygen in the air. So as our barometric pressure drops, when we multiply this by the percentage of oxygen in the air, this means our partial pressure of oxygen in the air decreases. And as the ambient partial pressure of oxygen decreases, this means our arterial partial pressure of oxygen decreases. And this is what we call hypoxia or hypoxic conditions, where there's a decrease in partial pressure of oxygen. And we have chemoreceptors in our arteries that detect low partial pressures of oxygen in our arteries, right? And as a result of this, what happens? So the chemoreceptors detect it. It sends an efferent message to the CNS. The CNS says we have low partial pressures of oxygen. So the efferent message would be to increase ventilation. Oh, did I say that right? So the chemoreceptors detect drop in partial pressure. It sends an afferent message to the CNS. The CNS and then sends an efferent message to increase ventilation. So this is one way we increase our oxygen in our arteries, our arterial blood, right? Through an increase in ventilation. So the first response we have to do with the respiratory system is an increase in ventilation. And this functions to increase our partial pressures of oxygen, but at the same time, cause a drastic decrease in CO2. So with this decreased CO2, our blood pH increases and we become alkaline, right? So think about that hemoglobin dissociation curve. Cold, our core body temp dropping, our pH increasing or we becoming alkaline is going to shift our hemoglobin oxygen dissociation curve to the left. What does this mean? Now we have less binding or less delivery of O2 to the mitochondria. And if we recall, the leftward shift means that there is a decreased offloading of oxygen from hemoglobin to myoglobin. And the reason for this is the affinity or binding of oxygen to hemoglobin is higher with this leftward shift. So, as you could probably say, so as a result of this leftward shift, now we're going to have a higher reliance on glycolysis or anaerobic metabolism, less reliance on aerobic metabolism because we have less O2 supply, right? And we need oxygen for aerobic metabolism. So that's what's happening with our respiratory system. With our renal system, we have an increase in erythropoietin, which is one of the benefits of being at altitude. And this is why people like to train high and live high, because they get the benefits of living at altitude, which is an increased erythropoietin, which is a hormone released from the kidney that increases red blood cell count and functions to increase hematocrit and our oxygen carrying capacity. The other thing that happens at the kidney is that there's an increased secretion of bicarbonate. So what this means is, if you recall, bicarbonate is our main buffer against acidosis in the blood, and functions, this should actually be a two-way arrow. So transforms to carbonic acid and then dissociates into water and CO2. And this CO2 is what we expel at the mouth. But if we get rid or excrete this bicarbonate, now we conserve a hydrogen ion, because this hydrogen ion has no bicarbonate to bind to. And so by secreting, increasing the amount of secretion of bicarbonate from the kidney, we are conserving our hydrogen ions, which is going to help to delay or retard our increase in pH, right? So it's going to help to maintain normal levels, normal pH levels at altitude. Okay, and the other response the renal system has is it's going to have an increase in diuresis. And this is going to be dictated or led by ANP, right? So we talked about how vasoconstriction, because we're cold, we're trying to conserve our heat in our core temp, in our core body. Vasoconstriction is happening, which increases our venous return, increases our pressure sensed at our atria, and AMP is released. So another response at the renal system is an increased diuresis. So at a metabolic response, seen from what we talked about earlier, there's a major shift to glycolysis, meaning glycogen is our main substrate. Even if we're not doing any high intense, or even when we're not doing any low intensity work, even when we're just walking, glycogen has to become our major substrate. Why? If we're shivering, we're going to be using primarily glycogen to fuel our shiver. Or the cold weather is going to decrease blood flow, right? We are vasoconstricted. So this means we have less mobilization of fats. And delivery of free fatty acids to the mitochondria. We had that leftward shift of our hemoglobin oxygen dissociation curve, which means we have less offloading of oxygen. So we'll have less oxygen available for use for energy or for metabolism. In addition, so we have less O2 delivery at the mitochondria. And in addition, we're at altitude. So our barometric pressure is reduced, which is going to reduce our ambient partial pressure of oxygen and our arterial partial pressure of oxygen. So the amount of oxygen available is drastically reduced. One, because of the environment, right? This is the environment that's causing a reduction. And then two, this is our physiological response to cold and increased pH. So we have different factors that are reducing the amount of oxygen that are going to be available to the mitochondria. One is our environment, right? The altitude itself is reducing the amount of oxygen that's going to be available to the mitochondria. And the second being, we have this leftward shift. So even though we have oxygen available, the delivery of oxygen is going to be reduced because of the hemoglobin dissociation curve shifting to the left. Let's see. And seeing that we have an increased shift or reliance on glycolysis, we would expect lactate production to increase. But at altitude, lactate concentration decreases over time. And this is what we call the lactate paradox, which I'm jumping ahead to. The lactate paradox talks about at altitude, we would expect our lactate concentrations to be much higher because, right, we have a shift on glycolysis, but at altitude, our lactate concentrations actually decrease over time, and there's no explanation for this. And that's what we call the lactate paradox. Okay, so we're gonna stop there and we will cover the last cardiovascular response next time. I'm gonna stop recording